When I'm in your presence, which do you choose? A rod of punishment and scolding, or a spirit of gentleness and love? 1 Corinthians 4, verse 21. Which do you choose? Gentleness or correction? As you scan over the relationship you've had with your parents, especially when you were living under their roof, you choose how that relationship is going to go. They've set the rules for you and the boundaries for you. They've set the curfew and the guidelines for you. You grow to learn what is right and what is wrong in their house, and it's their house, their rules. You know that they love you because they continue to feed you and clothe you, and they teach you, and they keep you from doing all the dumb things that you wish they would let you do. They say no to things that would harm you, even when you want them to say yes. And every day in their house, in your relationship with them, you have the choice of how your parents are going to approach you. You choose how it's going to be. With a rod of punishment and scolding and correction, or a spirit of gentleness and love. You choose. As the child, you choose. Paul's already described the relationship that he has with the church in Corinth. In 1 Corinthians 4, verse 14 and 15, he sees the church like his beloved children. He talks about how he is their spiritual father. And Paul says that when he comes to the church, this is a letter that's written after a few years of Paul being away, and he says, I'm soon going to be there if the Lord wills, chapter 4 and verse 19. And when he comes home to Corinth, when he comes home to his spiritual children, he will react in one of two ways based upon what he sees they are doing, based upon their choice. He will either take out the rod of correction and scolding, or when he comes home to the church in Corinth, he will come home with gentleness and love. But it was their choice of how their spiritual father reacted to them when he came home. It was based on how they were choosing to behave. Have you ever noticed as you think back upon your childhood that the only time you really hated to see your parents show up was when you were doing something wrong? You love to see them show up at ball games, cheer you on, or at school plays, talent shows. But when you were doing something outside of the boundaries they had set for you, you didn't want them to show up because you knew what was coming. It wasn't going to be gentleness. It wasn't going to be meekness. You knew exactly what was coming. It was the rod of correction. I had that feeling several times as a kid when mom would run out of fly swats because she broke the last one on my brother or sister, never me because I was the favorite or so I'm told. And she would say, you just wait till your dad gets home. Well, that just ruined the whole day. I wish you would have whipped me for 30 minutes rather than do that because I didn't know when dad would be home. It might have been at supper, it might have been, dark 30, but when dad's truck rolled down the driveway, and it was a long driveway, I would not be met with a spirit of gentleness, but with a rod of correction, or in my case, a belt of correction, because of how I was behaving that day, the rules I had chosen to break. But it was my choice. If I would have done what my mom said that day, if I would have been abiding by the house rules and behaving within the boundaries of their law, then the outcome would have been a lot different. I would have been met with gentleness, meekness, and love. But I, as a child, chose to go against that, and there were consequences because of that. And Paul takes that personal relationship, okay? He says that the children or the people at Corinth are his spiritual children. And he says, when I come home, which do you want? When I come to the church at Corinth, which do you want? The rod of correction because you've chosen to be disobedient, because you've chosen to be impenitent? Or I can come in the spirit of gentleness because you've chosen to submit or to repent or to obey. The choice is yours. As you read on in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, which we'll be discussing on Sunday, Lord willing, the church at Corinth was not behaving and staying within the boundaries of the God-given rules of the house. They were going beyond those things which were written. They were arrogant about the decisions of their lives. They refused to come under God and submit to Him. They were fighting with each other. They were loving themselves more than they were loving others. And they were committing immorality like the pagans wouldn't even believe. And it seems like the past years that Paul has been gone, it was like running a preschool or a daycare where correction and discipline and boundaries were ignored, and the kids had painted the rooms with their hand and climbed the walls and tore down the ceiling tiles and were eating them like goldfish crackers. Because there were some in the church thinking that Paul would not come back. That it was like a couple of years spring break without parents for them. They could do whatever they wanted to, chapter 4 and verse 18. And they were behaving like kids when the teacher leaves the room and they think the teacher's not coming back for a while. So they start throwing stuff around, making the desk into an octagon circle where they have mock MMA fights because they don't think the authority is coming back. And it was their choice to behave that way. The church at Corinth had the teaching of Apollos, the teaching of Peter, the teaching of Paul. They knew the truths of God in Jesus Christ. And if they refused to follow the rules of God's house, Paul would bring the rod of correction when he came back. There'd be no spirit of gentleness when he went to town on their hind end. There's something in Christianity nowadays that I hear with monotonous regularity. And that is that we must always approach situations within the church with a gentle spirit. That we don't need to speak harshly or intensely about things. We don't need to get tough with someone or anyone who comes to need a rebuke so that their feelings get hurt. And to an extent, I will agree with that. I don't need to be harsh all the time. I don't need to speak intensely all the time. But I'm not going to be gentle all the time either. And this has become painfully obvious in my role as a father to my kids. There are times to be gentle, and there are times where I have a gentle spirit. And there are times not to be gentle, and when I do not have a gentle spirit. If one of my kids just blatantly refuses to do what they're told, then that is a time I'm not going to be gentle. That's a time for the rod of correction, for a scolding of epic proportions. There are times where gentleness is not the right option. Matter of fact, the root word that Paul uses here when he says rod is a staff in which a person is beaten. And in ancient Greco-Roman culture, that doesn't sound fun. It can mean also to smack across the face with a hand, or even to box a person's ears. Doesn't sound gentle. And it definitely grabs the attention of the one who's being disobedient. I'm sure my parents were just as creative, or your parents were just as creative as mine when it came to punishment. If there was an off-color or rebellious comment made around my mom, by my brother mostly, of course, me being the favorite, if you remember, anything would do that she could swing at that hind end. You know, shoes, fly swat hand, whatever was near. And I'm sure that some of you have felt the rather stern smack on the lips from your mother as you said something you shouldn't have in her presence. That well-placed, just the right strength smack to let you know, don't keep doing it. It'll get worse. You keep talking, it's gonna get worse. Later on, as I grew up, I would rather be given a belt than to have my dad scold me for 30 minutes because the belt was so much quicker. And then I could go back to what I thought was important. And maybe Dad got onto that because after a while it was just mostly the scoldings I got. And to this day, I think he's going over an outline for his lesson or his sermon on Sunday when he was scolding me. But anyway, it's a choice. A rod of correction or a spirit of gentleness. It's a choice when it comes to children, when it comes to those who are being led. It is based upon how we as children of God are behaving. And here's the big thing. Sin in the church, which Paul is going to be dealing with heavily in the next chapter. Sin in the church is not to be handled with a spirit of meekness. The Corinthian church was guilty of hard to even talk about sins, and those had to be dealt with in a hard manner. Paul's going to say in 1 Corinthians 5 verse 2, let him who has done this be removed from among you. Paul wanted the person guilty of this sin to be taken out of the church to the woodshed and given the rod of correction. Sin had to be dealt with and dealt with sternly. Now I want you to listen. A parent who refuses to correct their child, when that child is sinning against them and God, and rather chooses to be gentle, is themselves pouring leaven into the dough of their own children's lives. And just a little leaven, as Paul's going to say in the next chapter, leavens the whole lump. Do you as a child of God have sin which you have refused to deal with? When that sin is found out by your Father, it has been already, it will be corrected one way or another. But wouldn't you rather be met with love and the spirit of gentleness because you're penitent, because you're contrite, and want to do nothing more in this life than to walk submissively and obediently to your Father?